everybody. Welcome back to the Lila Rose Show. Today, we've got breaking news out of the United Kingdom. Parliament has just moved forward to approve assisted dying, as they call it, in the UK. That's assisted suicide, meaning healthcare professionals can help kill patients who want to commit suicide. Absolutely tragic and heartbreaking. We're going to be unpacking what this means with bioethicist and author and professor Charlie Camosy in a few minutes. But I wanted to give a few more headlines that are really important about the emerging picture in the Western world, where the Western world, Western civilization, is on a suicidal mission, a mission for self-destruction, where one country after the next increasingly is legalizing suicide. Imagine that you're driving over a bridge and you see some commotion on the side of the road. There's a man standing on a ledge about to jump off to his death, clearly a troubled person. And so there's police officers, there's passerbys who are standing there trying to coax him off the ledge. This is civilization at some of its best moments. People coming around together to try to help somebody on the brink of death, literally, trying to kill themselves and instead trying to help them save their life. And why? Why do we do that? Because we value human life, because human life is sacred and nobody, not even the individual, has the right to take a life, including their own. That is the operational assumption of Western civilization. Human life is sacred. We should organize society to protect human life. Human life is worth fighting for, and that nobody, especially not doctors, have the right to kill. In fact, they have a responsibility to heal and to help. This doesn't mean that we make an idol out of life. We know that death is a part of life, but there is a tremendous moral difference between taking a life and allowing a life to die naturally. And this distinction is, of course, at the root of all ethical questions that are being made daily in hospitals dealing with terminally ill patients or patients near the end of their lives. So in the UK this last week, in a 330 to 275 vote, so this was a margin of just 45 votes, the House of Commons voted to allow the terminally ill adults bill, which would grant the option of assisted dying, they call it, in England and Wales with terminal diagnosis and a life expectancy of 6 months or less. Now, this is actually very close to what California currently has on the books. So in the state of California, there is a law which permits people to take their lives with the help of medical professionals, provided that they are given only 6 months to live by their doctor, they're 18 years old, and they have chosen this. I want to read briefly from an article written by a woman whose husband committed suicide with the help of a doctor in California just this last year. And I thought this was a powerful depiction of what we're really talking about. She says that he was very sick. He was suffering from stage 4 lymphoma. He wanted to end his life. And she goes on to say that they requested this appointment and they sit down and he takes this drug to kill himself. And she says specifically, we set up a comfortable outdoor space on the patio. Gary was able to say goodbye to everyone he loved. He was enshrouded in a bubble of love, she says. She says, I couldn't function. It was all too emotional. Beautiful plants and flowers surrounded him. He sucked on a popsicle to mask the bitter taste of the medication. He passed out almost immediately. She says, it was as dignified as anyone could want. Again, very subjective. But she says, yet the thought of it still burns. I hope our story helps Californians better understand their options. This is an example of trying to paint it in the very best light. Somebody who took a drug to kill themselves on their porch with the help of a doctor in the state of California. And she says, even though this was dignified, she claims, the wife, the thought of it still burns. It burns because you were there at the murder of your husband, at the suicide of your husband. And we see that in all of the arguments made for assisted dying, and we're going to get into some of the best arguments made for assisted suicide. Charlie is going to discuss them on the show in just a few minutes. You see at the core what we're dealing with is the killing. It is the killing of a vulnerable patient. And I want to take a look too for you all about what's happening in Canada. Canada has increasingly been legalizing assisted suicide. And increasingly legalizing it not just for people who are terminally ill physically near the end of their lives, who are over the age of 18, but also for people who choose to commit suicide and have the doctor help them, even for quote unquote social reasons. This is an article from The Guardian, and it says an expert committee reviewing euthanasia deaths in Canada's most populous province has identified several cases in which patients asked to be killed in part for social reasons such as isolation and fears of homelessness. So horrifically tragic, people dying because they feel alone and because they don't have a home. And so they ask to have a doctor help them kill themselves, basically have a doctor murder them because they don't have a home. This is inevitably where assisted suicide leads, is it does lead to euthanasia. It leads to people who are weak, not just because they're near the end of their life physically, but sometimes mentally weak or sometimes even mentally incapable. And we're going to actually talk about that with Charlie, a case of a woman who was suffering from dementia, and she fought against her family and the doctor trying to give her a lethal injection, and they prevailed and killed her. This is the direction that Western civilization will go if we don't stop it. And so I'm sharing this episode with you as a urgent news update about what is happening right now in the West. We're going to be deep diving this more in future episodes, but here's my conversation with Charlie Camosy, bioethicist, professor, and author of 8 books. Charlie, thanks so much for joining the podcast.
Hi, Lila. Great to be with you.
Did I get it right? Is it 8 books now?
It is 8 with 2 on the way, working away at those 2 as well. So
amazing. Congratulations.
Thank you.
For those that aren't familiar with your work yet, Charlie, give us a little bit of background on yourself and your work.
Well, I've been in the academy now for almost 16 years, and I am a moral theologian and bioethicist, and for a long time, spent most of my time on beginning of life issues. I wrote a book called Beyond the Abortion Wars and really thought long and hard about how to try to win the pro-life movement, inspired by people like you and others at Live Action, but also in the academic world. And one of those people I engage in the academic world is a philosopher named Peter Singer, a secular philosopher who you might think a pro-life academic like me wouldn't have much in common with. But on the end of life issues we're talking about today, the beginning of life issues we're going to talk about some other time, and many other issues, I think the engagement with secular bioethics is so important because it really shows the kind of dark places that we're headed right now.
So let's start there with the dark places we're headed, because that's the headlines just a few days ago coming out of the UK. And then there's, news stories cropping up here in California about a push to legalize assisted suicide in California. There is already some law legalizing it in very rare cases, but there's a push to do more of that. Can you start us with the lay of the land? This is a big question, but what is the general Western world looking like when it comes to permitting assisted suicide? And also give us a definition of what we're talking about for people's clarity. There is a lot of, I think, misunderstanding today. And when the definitions are not clear, that's how I think, unfortunately, the lobby to legalize assisted suicide can get away with literally, I believe, murder. But give us the lay of the land. I'm so excited to share about our partner, fountofgrace.com. Fount of Grace creates the most beautiful, handcrafted, exclusively designed necklaces, earrings, rings, and rosaries that make incredible gifts for your loved one. These are hand casts made from precious metals with these beautiful designs that you'll love to wear or your loved one will love to wear. Fount of Grace is also American designed and made. So this is a family business that sources their product in the United States. And I am wearing one of their pieces here, this beautiful necklace. I have been wearing it for the last few weeks. I think you'll love their stuff. It's delicate. It's beautifully designed. And if you order from fountofgrace.com today, you can get $15 off any order using the code Lila at checkout. So go to fountofgrace.com today and use the code Lila at checkout. You will get $15 off your order and get a beautifully packaged Fount of Grace exclusive piece to give as a gift for yourself or for a loved one. Check them out today. That's fountofgrace.com.
So maybe start with what this even is. So let's try to define what assisted suicide is. Assisted suicide is the participation of a healthcare provider, usually, but not only a physician, to help somebody kill themselves, to commit suicide. I tend to use the word killing. I talk about physician-assisted killing even more, because sometimes in circumstances there isn't a kind of cooperation of the individual. So for instance, in a case where someone has dementia early on, this happened in the Netherlands a few years ago, someone with early stage dementia said, hey, I want physician assisted suicide. And then later, as the progress of the disease went forward, when they gave them the deadly drug, it didn't kill them right away, and they were struggling and they were pushing back against the attempt to kill them. And so I think it's better described as physician assisted killing, which is also a kind of euthanasia. If we're going to talk about how this has spread, how this is going sort of right now, the United States is a pretty complicated place when it comes to it. A significant number of states have legalized it, but a significant number have also kept it at bay. So my current book project, the working title is A Culture on the Brink. So I think we're on the brink in the United States of sort of tipping one way or the other on this. And I do think there's interesting places where this isn't being legalized. So in deep blue states out here on the East Coast where I work, New York, Connecticut, Maryland have all rejected it for many years now. In fact, have rejected it. Other states like California, New Jersey, where I live, Oregon, Washington, there's been some really bad slippage on this. In Europe, certain countries there have had it for quite a while. The Netherlands and Belgium and Switzerland has something called Dignitas, which is essentially assisted suicide tourism, where people who have it illegal in their country or their state can go and get it done in Switzerland. That's been around for a while. But as you point out, there was a big vote recently in the United Kingdom, a first vote, I guess. I'm not an expert on UK politics, but I think they have to go through a couple more votes to formally legalize it. But the first vote there was slippage in the United Kingdom, which is a big development as well.
So the slippage that's in the news right now in the United Kingdom, as you call it, the slippage towards, going from the brink, plunging into the abyss of a culture of death. My understanding is the Prime Minister has said that he would, sign into law. I don't know exactly how British politics works as well, but he would ultimately say yes to a law that Parliament would want to approve assisted suicide in the country. So it looks like, what is there hope in the UK that they'll be able to stop this? I understand the vote was very close. What do you know about what's going on in the UK right now?
What I've read is that what passed was something called the second reading, and it still needs to be passed, I think, by the House of Lords and also by a third reading in the House of Commons. And what I've seen, I don't know how real this is, but there's some hope out there that I've seen, which is I think a number of people, MPs, members of Parliament, voted for this in part to continue the debate and may in fact be persuadable to vote against it in the third reading. And so the vote was actually close enough that the number of people who did that could in fact change their minds. Now, I'm not a political insider of any kind when it comes to this. I don't know what could happen, but signs point to not so good right now, but maybe not totally despondent.
What is the Steelman argument to make for assisted suicide? What are the arguments that folks are currently making in the UK to say we need to have this? We shouldn't have to travel to Switzerland and do tourism if we want to end our lives. We should be able to do this. This is the humane thing to do.
Well, I'm going to give you the Steelman argument. I don't think it's the most common version of the argument. I think the most common version is a pretty bad argument, which is people should just sort of be able to do what they want, right? That's just sort of a straight up no chaser autonomy. I get to do what I want, regardless of who that hurts, regardless of the kind of society it produces, regardless of what that does to the very concept of medicine itself. I get to do what I want because I'm autonomous and I'm strong and I can make these decisions. It's a terrible argument. We can get into reasons for why that's terrible, and I suggested some of them just now. But maybe if we're going to steelman the argument, it would be something like this. There are disadvantaged people who don't have access to the best palliative care, the best pain management, and they die in some cases in very terrible agony. And who in their right minds and in their right hearts could sit back and watch that happen? Who would not want to intervene to protect individuals, to help give people a kind of way out from that kind of horrific agony? And therefore, we need physician-assisted killing to help people in those stages. Now, I think it's important to mention, very important to mention, that in almost every survey that's done on this, that kind of scenario, though it's very persuasive, it's very it produces a lot of sympathy. doesn't even make the top 5 reasons people actually request physician-assisted killing. So Oregon has been keeping track of this for a while. The top reason why people request physician-assisted killing in Oregon is because they fear their loss of their autonomy. Also high on the list, fear of being a burden on others, fear of loss of enjoyable activities. Again, physical pain and suffering doesn't even make the top 5 reasons. So this is, and also, shouldn't we be, this was a big focus of the UK debate. Shouldn't we be focused actually on better palliative care? In my time when I was at Fordham, before my current job, I took some of my students to a service learning part of their bioethics course at Calvary Hospice Hospital in the Bronx, run by just an amazing physician who said, we never get any requests for people to end their lives here. We never are unable to control their pain here, in fact. And so we don't need to choose, in fact, between being sympathetic to people in those very desperate, very real, very difficult situations. Let's not, paper over that. Let's deal with that in its full reality. But let's acknowledge that we can focus on getting people better palliative care, and we don't need to kill them. We can kill the pain. We don't need to kill the patient.
So walk us through what is palliative care. And can you also explain the distinction between using, as an example, morphine, a painkiller, to alleviate suffering towards the end of life? And it can also sometimes increase the likelihood of death, is my understanding, because the patient may forego food and water or other things because they're in a certain drugged state, but how certain drugs to alleviate suffering may also have an effect of accelerating a near death that may be happening, but that is different, incredibly different. The moral distinction is huge between that and then using drugs to ultimately kill a patient, using lethal drugs to end the patient's life. A huge thank you to our sponsor, Good Ranchers. GoodRanchers.com is American meat delivered. This is meat 100% sourced in the United States from American farmers and ranchers. You can get your beef, your pork, your poultry, your seafood, all from GoodRanchers.com. The steaks are absolutely delicious, I know from personal experience, and even better is their chicken. I love it. It's tender, juicy, flavorful, all the things that you could want. And GoodRanchers.com is doing an amazing special right now where if you order any subscription box, you will get one whole free year of a free add-on of your choice. That's a free add-on of ground beef, chicken breasts, I highly recommend those, salmon, or bacon. And if you use the code Lila at checkout, you will get not only your free add-on for a year, but you will get $25 off your first order, as well as fast free shipping. That's GoodRanchers.com, American meat delivered.
Yeah, this is where if we're going to steel man the argument again in a different way, we can say actually what many of us in the pro-life movement who want to defend the dignity of the human person at this stage of life would permit sometimes looks an awful lot like the very thing that we're criticizing. But it's important to make the distinction you just made, so let's make it. When one is aiming at killing the pain of the patient via morphine, that's quite different from aiming at the death of the person via morphine, right? So if I were to say, okay, my relative is in terrible pain right now, I want to kill the pain. In order to kill the pain, I got to give them X amount of morphine, right? And I foresee, but don't intend that this may in fact lead to their death or lead to their death being sped up, perhaps because it inhibits respiration or, like you said, in conjunction with lack of nutrition and hydration, this may in fact speed up their death. But I don't intend it, I just merely foresee it. That can be totally legitimate, in fact is totally legitimate, and almost everyone sort of agrees with that. If, however, one is using the morphine to aim at the death of the patient, right, to say, like, I'm going to give you X amount of morphine so that you die right now, right? I intend to kill you to save the pain. I'm not killing the pain, I'm killing the patient, right? That's the goal. Then that's deeply problematic. That's euthanasia. That's assisted suicide, and that aims at the death of an individual. But you can see how, if you're not attentive to that very important distinction, and here's one way I like to think about the distinction. sometimes call it the Camosy piss test. My students don't necessarily like it when I invoke this, but imagine that the person survives, right? Imagine the person survives. In the first scenario, one is overjoyed, right? Because one was never aiming at the death of the person. They were aiming at killing the pain, right? Not the person. In the second scenario, if the person survived, one is not happy, right? Because the whole point of using that morphine was, in fact, to kill the patient. So that test can sometimes be used to sort of illustrate the difference between what on the surface might look very similar, but is in fact totally morally different.
Can you walk us through the difference between an extraordinary measure that someone may be getting to sustain their life versus foregoing that extraordinary measure? And that might be in a case, breathing, respiratory assistance. And how in one case, this can be completely licit and someone could even pass away because they say no to an extraordinary measure. But in another situation and context, this extraordinary measure is not extraordinary and they would need to be given it. And otherwise not giving the patient this care would be actually a violation of the Hippocratic Oath to protect that patient's life. I think this is, again, where the context of what the patient is enduring or the state of the patient is crucial when deciding what are the ethical treatments and what are the non-ethical treatments.
Yeah, this is something I focus in on my current book project in a very serious way as well. For your viewers or listeners who are Christians, it's probably no surprise to think about the fact that pursuing life at any cost, literally any cost, is an example of idolatry and not something we should be pursuing, right? Christ on the cross is a very classic example of this, the martyrs of old, of course, and the martyrs of recent vintage, of course, too. So grasping for more life at any cost is not at all what pro-lifers stand for. Quite the contrary. I mean, there may be very important considerations that would involve, again, the example we just used, right? Morphine to control a patient's life one could foresee that would be the result of this, but it's not what we're aiming at, right? So totally legitimate. Another example would be a ventilator, right? If somebody were to say, like, I'm not choosing to kill myself, I'm just choosing that I don't want my last remaining days to be on a ventilator, but I'm not aiming at my death. In fact, if you take me off the vent and I continue to breathe, that doesn't frustrate me. I'm not upset about that because, again, I wasn't aiming at my own death. It's a choice about how to live, not a choice about how to die. Similar things could be said about the levels of, say, chemotherapy with end-stage cancer. Back in the day, they would say, and sometimes now they suggest, maybe if you move to a different climate, you could live a few more years, right? Or have an extended time. Nobody is saying that you can't choose to stay at home in the home of your ancestors or where your kids or family is to die in their particular area, even though you might live a little bit longer if you move down south or you move to a desert area or something like this. So there's tons of examples where we would say, totally legitimate to choose to live this way, foreseeing but not intending death might come sooner. But as long as you're not aiming at death, that can certainly be justified. Now, let me also say, though, and this is important, one can also, by omission, aim at death. So it's not just, giving somebody a pill in their coffee, as happened with a dementia patient in the Netherlands. It's not just giving somebody an injection or this horrible new suicide machine. I don't know if you or your listeners have seen this. One can aim at death by omission. I happen to be Catholic. The Catholic definition of euthanasia is an act or an omission, which of itself or by intention causes death. And I think intuitively, many people of all different perspectives can say, well, I can aim at death by omission, right? I can choose not to help somebody so that they die, right? And so removing food and water, not engaging with food and water, refusing to intubate somebody because they're disabled. That was something that happened during the pandemic, unfortunately, in some circumstances. One can still aim at death by omission as well. And so the real key is to think hard about whether we're aiming at death or not.
So what are some practical bright lines for how to do that in the medical field? And then also for family members or friends, and you're trying to make judgment calls for your loved one about what treatments to say yes or no to. Are there bright lines that folks should be familiar with? And then as part of that, why is it always wrong to ever seek death for a patient? Give us that argument too, because I think we've sort of been presupposing that as a premise here in our conversation. But I do think making that case is important, especially in today's day and age.
Yeah, well, I mean, that gets to fundamental first principles about theology and philosophy and like what we believe to be ultimately true about reality. And if we think that human beings are the kinds of creatures that have irreducible value, that have value that's not based on contingent things like how much you cost or how much relative ability you have, or what sort of productivity level you have in society. One of the phrases I hate most is productive member of society. Can we please stop saying this as if this has some sort of indication for how much value someone has, whether you're a productive member of society? That's not why human beings have value. And aiming at the death of people, trying to make them dead is a direct attack on that inherent dignity, right? And that's why so many people, including secular people, believe that we should never do this. And fundamental human equality says we should never do this, regardless of the circumstance in which a human being finds themselves. Young, old, disabled, poor, rich, it doesn't matter. Those are all accidental traits. The essential value is the dignity of the human person. And I'd also say, in the context of healthcare, it adds another layer to this, which is healthcare providers are, it turns out, supposed to provide healthcare, right? They're supposed to aim at improving the health of their patients. Um, there's no way in which we can describe killing patients, aiming at the death of their patients, as somehow consistent with what it means to provide healthcare. This is one of the big points I think we need to make about this in the United Kingdom and many other places is once you allow this to happen, once you say healthcare providers can kill their patients and still call it healthcare, you've lost any coherent sense of what healthcare actually is. I call it the Burger Kingification of healthcare. It's just, if you get it your way, it's fast food. It's like the customer's always right. There's no professional ends-based understanding of what this even is anymore, right? It's just whatever you can provide. We can make a contract and you can give it to me and that's it. So we in fact will lose. We are in the process of losing the very notion of what it means to provide healthcare as a coherent concept at all.
What are some of the bright lines that family members and people should be aware of when they're dealing with medical professionals, especially in a state like California where assisted suicide is legal? Now it needs to be asked for within 6 months of the terminal diagnosis, meaning that they're told they're going to die in 6 months. It needs to be asked by an adult over the age of 18. So there's not like you're going to be in a hospital in California and, hopefully not killed by some nurse. That's not the state, right. At least not yet of our state. But what are some things that you would recommend family members be on the lookout in the United States, particularly, and in other places? We have listeners from all over the world when they're dealing with medical professionals, especially for loved ones who are weak, whether they're having mental issues or they're physically suffering or near the end of their lives. EveryLife.com is America's fastest growing baby diaper and wipes company. I love EveryLife because this is a premium product made from the best materials for your little one. And EveryLife.com is a pro-life company. When you go to EveryLife.com/join, you can join the Changing Lives Club. This way you can set up a subscription to get your diapers and your wipes, these premium products delivered right to your door for your little one. And after 3 months of the subscription, you will be able to donate for free a month's supply of diapers to a mom and a baby in need. So what are you waiting for? Go to EveryLife.com/join. Join the Changing Lives Club. Use the code Lila at checkout. Get 10% off your order, start your subscription, and after 3 months, you can donate a full month's supply of diapers to a mom and a baby in need.
This is such an important question, and it's a focus of my book. In fact, I just finished an appendix to the book last week where I was trying to lay out some just like flip to the back of the book type things when your loved one gets sick or in the situation to describe precisely that. So I have a couple of these sort of ready to hand. One of them is it's not a bright line, but it's more of a strategy. It's basically be the squeaky wheel, right? Be the loud person, be the person who is not necessarily obnoxious, but the person who is asking questions, the person who is talking to the nurses, the person who is making sure that the social workers know exactly what's going on, the person who is willing to call an ethics consult, the person who knows their legal rights, the person who is informed on the current law in their state, right? And be the person that shows up, right, in the clinic, in the care home. Don't be the person that just calls in once in a while. Let the staff know that you're going to be there and you're going to be present and that you want the wishes of your family member to be respected. Red flags would be those that, for instance, just are hostile to this sense of how to do things. So If you say something like, I believe food and water is not medical treatment, but just basic care for individuals. And so we will not be removing food and water from my mother. And people look at you like you got a third eye or something. That's obviously a red flag. The more, it's not always the case, but the more that the medical team talks about things like quality of life, and you of course wouldn't want your loved one to be on all these machines and having those things. And again, based on what we just talked about, one could of course choose to forego those. But if that's not what the patient wants, if that's not what you and your family have decided you want, that sort of language can also be a red flag. I'd also come back to the piss test or the upset test, like how just try to play it out. Like if the person um, lived, would this be consistent with the goals of the procedures and other kinds of things that are being done here? If they lived, would it be okay? Probably you're in the clear. If you get the sense that whatever is going on here is sort of aiming at the death, would result in the person's death and the person survive, it wouldn't be consistent with what the medical team is after, that's also a deep red flag as well.
In your book, as you're doing the work for your book, Charlie, are you looking at the stories of families who have had basically bad things happen to them because of their medical professionals who were more interested in hastening death than they were about sustaining life?
Yeah, absolutely. I don't want to impugn a whole profession, and I won't impugn a whole profession. There are plenty of very good physicians, nurses, medical teams, hospital administrators out there. And especially if one is in a Catholic hospital, one can point to the ethical and religious directives, whether one is Catholic or not, and say, this is what you guys stand for, and hold them accountable to those. That's another place to go, maybe in terms of recommendations, is if you have a choice, maybe you want to be seen in a Catholic hospital where you can hold the staff accountable to ethical and religious directives. But I will say, in other contexts, and sometimes, unfortunately, in Catholic contexts as well, there are medical teams that will try to take advantage of the situation and try to say, especially when a person is vulnerable, when a person doesn't speak English, when a person is alone and doesn't have someone advocating for them, to kind of work their will to try to move things in the direction that they want it moved. And sometimes it's as subtle as just the way something is described. Again, like, well, you wouldn't want us to pound on your chest and put tubes inside you, right? And that might result in a DNR, a do not resuscitate order, that maybe wasn't explicitly given. Certainly, this is what happens in the United Kingdom, unfortunately. Another example, it's tough to talk about, but it's real, is something called slow and show coding. So if a patient or their proxy says, we want full code, we want everything done for this patient, which again is not required, but the legitimate choice of many people. Sometimes a medical team that disagrees with that full code will do what's called a slow or a show code. They'll pretend they're going full code. They'll pretend they're going through the process of doing everything. But in reality, because they disagree with the decision, they're really aiming at the death of the individual by omission, right? They're saying, it's not always the case, but in some cases they've made the judgment this person is too disabled. They're in too much pain. Who would want to live like this? And they're making their own judgments about that situation, and then slow or show code the situation the way in order to try to get the situation they want to get.
Do you have stories? Have you talked to families who have experienced some of this in the U.S.?
Oh yeah. As I think you know, I was on Tucker Carlson's show recently, and as you may imagine, I got tons of emails after that appearance, and the comments on the YouTube link for the show, example after example after example after endless example of this. And here's maybe an important point we could drive home. So much of this is driven by judgments about, as I mentioned before, the level of disability of the individual, right? Maybe they have a catastrophic brain injury, or they're paraplegic, or they have spina bifida or something like this. And I think it's just important to say most of these professions, and that's not limited to physicians, but those that are privileged, come from levels of privilege, tend to make these judgments about their quality of life. In fact, there's some data to show that physicians rate the quality of life of their patients 2 points on a 10-point scale less than the patients themselves
Wow.
do. And so almost all of these stories, Lila, were examples of from the beginning of life, but also the end of life, where very clearly there was an ableist judgment being made. And here's a very important point to drive home in light of that. Our strongest allies in these fights very often are disability rights groups. Those who are willing to say, you know what you're telling us when you say people who've lost their autonomy, people who have lost enjoyable activities, people who are fear being a burden on others should maybe think about killing themselves. You're talking about us. You're talking about our communities. And if that's the case, that is abhorrent. We tried to leave this whole notion behind after the Nuremberg trials, right? We have not left it behind. In fact, we're re-engaging the horrific sort of logic of this. And I think just to go back to that one example of the person with dementia in the Netherlands, they were struggling. They put the drug in the coffee. It did not kill them. The person was struggling, clearly not on board with whatever was happening. The family and the physician held them down and finished the job.
What does that mean, they finished the job?
Well, I don't know exactly how they killed him. That's why I want to be extremely careful about this. But and so I'd have to go back to the actual article. But what I feel very comfortable saying is that they had to physically restrain the person to finish the job, whether it was giving them another drink or giving them an injection of some kind. But once we're in that territory, Lila, I mean, what are we talking about here? I mean, we're talking about something that's akin to the very things we put people on trial for in Nuremberg. And we said never again. And we're not there yet. Let's be clear. Not every case is like that one. That's a pretty dramatic example. But the very fact that we would go there and engage in that kind of logic, and we have a dementia crisis where this problem is just going to present itself more and more often, and especially cultures like the United Kingdom and Canada and certain states where they have a crisis of resources to care for people in these cases. There's going to be an incredible amount of pressure to expand this to kill people with catastrophic brain injuries, people with dementia, and other cases as well.
There is, I think, an argument that some make that say, well, the hospital system wants to do endless procedures because they can bill more for it and they make more money the sicker you are. And in a sense, the longer you live, why would a hospital system or hospital staff, and why increasingly are many of them interested actually in potentially ending the life of the patient and not continuing to extend care? And how does that fit with the narrative that, well, some of these people and these systems are in it for money?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's a legitimate critique in many circumstances. And that gets, I don't think we want to lose sight of our previous discussion about idolatry and extending life at any cost, and the possible incentives that some hospitals and healthcare providers might have to do precisely that. Unfortunately, there's all sorts of other pressures in other ways that produce a very different kind of push. For instance, in California and in other places as well. The case I'm thinking about is in California. Medi-Cal was asked to cover a particular kind of cancer treatment by a patient under Medi-Cal. Medi-Cal said, no, we're not going to cover that cancer treatment. But hey, we got physician-assisted killing for you if you want. And again, if you think about the huge financial pressures that Medicaid and Medi-Cal and other systems around the world are under, it has a certain kind of logic to it. It has a certain kind of understanding. Well, we're not forcing them to do it. We're just giving them the option, right? But again, if we think of people under the kind of pressure that they feel that lead them to this, especially being a burden on others, then we can see this has a pernicious logic all its own. So yes, in certain circumstances, the pressure would go one way, maybe towards over-treatment. We need to avoid that. But in many other circumstances, the pressure is going quite a different way.
I was looking up the case you were referencing, the coffee euthanasia case, and you were right. I mean, this was a 74-year-old woman who had Alzheimer's, and early on in the disease, she was saying she would want to die before going into a care home. And they administered the initial drug in her coffee. She didn't die. She sat up and tried to pull away from the administering of a second drug, and they held her down and forcibly killed her. And that's what caused so much consternation in the Netherlands, as it should, because someone at the brink of death. I mean, I could imagine someone saying, I would want to die if, but does that give them, first of all, themselves the right to kill themselves, or anyone else the right to kill them?
Yeah, and two more things to say about that. The doctor who did that was not convicted of any crime. A second thing is, what is the presumption, right? If if somebody were to quote unquote wake up in that circumstance is clearly struggling, why would the presumption be to kill them, right? Why wouldn't the presumption be to at least stop, right? And say, well, we're in this new situation here. We thought the person would be dead from the drug and the coffee. They're clearly not. Now they're struggling. We have this new situation. Let's maybe evaluate it. Let's pause for a few days. Let's try to figure out how to handle this situation. Maybe even try, if they have moments of lucidity, try to discern what it is they want now, if it's different from what they wanted before. That wasn't at all, right, the reaction. The reaction was, hey, it's time for them to die right now. And that's the kind of, and of course it has to do with their disability, right? Like, how could it not? This is a judgment about the quality of life, of course, about people with Alzheimer's disease, with later stage dementia. And again, we have this crisis upon us now, Lila. Right now, we put these individuals essentially in way stations of death and care homes where they're desperately lonely. Sometimes they put them in, the New York Times did an expose and said they often put them in what's called chemical straitjackets, which is essentially giving them antipsychotic drugs when they have no psychosis, but because it keeps them docile, they do it anyway. And it doubles their chance of death. It doubles their chance of death and they do it anyway. But Lila, in 20 years, the number of people with dementia is going to double. In 30 years, if nothing is done, it's going to triple. If we're already doing this now, right? And California is trying, as we speak, the people pushing for assisted suicide expansion in California are trying to devise a way to expand assisted suicide in California specifically to kill people with dementia, Alzheimer's disease. I mean, what are we going to do? I mean, I'm as pro-life as they come, as you know, but even I would look at the situation and say, well, what are my options here, right? I can waste away in this terrible place and watch cable news all day, maybe be talked to by a robot and given a chemical straitjacket, which keeps me docile. Or I could choose this, right? Those aren't great options, but I could understand it's wrong, but I can understand why someone would be tempted to have physician-assisted suicide. But that is the very definition of coercion, right? That is not a free choice. That is a horrific coercion of people who are incredibly vulnerable, and we absolutely have to do better. But this dementia crisis is something we have to respond to. Otherwise, we're already in deep trouble, but we're going to be in really deep trouble if we don't find an answer to it.
Well, and I think I know you're going to come in studios in a few weeks, Charlie. We're going to deep dive that because I think that's an existential question that I know you've been studying and exploring. What are we going to do as Western civilization with not only a troubled healthcare system, poor healthcare infrastructure at large and the attitudes that plague the healthcare world, but also the declining populations. We're having aging demographics. And so what happens when there's a ton of older folks and not enough younger folks to take care of them?
And you've been on that one. I've seen on social media, having your babies. We need to have people have more babies.
Doing my part, Charlie.
You're doing it. You're going for it. We need it. That's one of my main conclusions in the book is we can talk about improving care homes all we want. We could talk about reimbursement rates. We could talk about paying workers a living wage. These are all important. But at the end of the day, it's the family that we need to strengthen to address these foundational questions. And those questions about how we strengthen the family are existential, foundational questions that are absolutely humongous on so many levels. But without that too, I mean, that's maybe one very important takeaway here is whenever I speak to immigrant families in my area who have more intact families than we tend to have in the United States here, they're just aghast at the way that we treat our elderly, right? They can't believe that we would ever think about pushing their elderly loved ones away in the way that we do. They welcome them into their homes. They rearrange their whole lives to care for them. And I'm not trying to hate on anybody here who doesn't choose to do that. There are all sorts of complicated reasons why we don't. But that's a foundational question. How do we strengthen the family? How do we have the bonds of the family and the extended family, not just the nuclear family, the extended family around to properly care for our loved ones who otherwise might be, in fact, will be pushed to end their lives via physician-assisted killing if we don't find that sort of foundational solution.
Charlie, thanks so much for joining today. I know it's last minute because of the news breaking last Friday from the UK. How can people find your work?
They can go to charlescamosy.com or find me on Twitter X at @Camosy, CCAMOSY. Thank you, Lila, for having me. I'm looking forward to the in-person conversation in a few weeks.
Me too. Thanks so much, Charlie. Thanks so much for listening to this episode of the Lila Rose podcast. Please share this episode with a friend or a family member to spread the truth about assisted suicide and help the show reach more people. A huge thank you to our partner, EWTN. EWTN is the largest religious network reaching millions of people with the truth of the faith, entertainment, and news. Check them out at EWTN.com.